and say to me, Alexei, what is alternative new wave Marxist comedy? And I say, sod off, you nosy bastard.
In the late 70s, there was a sudden boom in stand-up comedy, in young people wanting to get up and tell jokes.
So it wasn't that the attitudes were new, it was just expressing it in the form of stand-up comedy were new.
Somewhere in the late 70s, comedy clubs started springing up, particularly originally in New York and Los Angeles, and the Comedy Store was one of those clubs, still going to this day, famously, on Sunset Boulevard in Los Angeles. And a man called Peter Rosengard, who was an insurance salesman, was in Los Angeles on business or on holiday, I don't know, and went to the Comedy Store.
Peter Rosengard was totally instrumental, and he'd gone to the States, he'd seen it, he thought it was a great idea. He persuaded a Soho strip club to let him have a room, and he made it all happen.
The Comedy Store was very exciting, really. I think it was, it was in a topless bar in Soho. Soho was very different then as well. It was still very rough, you know, a lot of gangsterism and, you know, a lot of porn and, you know, it felt much less safe than it does today, really, much less friendly.
The Comedy Store years, or they kind of are remembered through a kind of lager-induced haze for the most part. It was quite difficult to remain sober before you had to go on and do your bit.
It was sweaty, dark, smoky, full of drunks, people who'd wandered in by mistake thinking they were going to the strip club, and often really, really dull because people would get up and do terrible sets, but also unbelievably exciting.
When you consider that someone like Alexei Sayle or even someone like Andy de la Tour were doing their stuff, it'd be followed by, you know, a guy doing a fish dance, you know, and slapping a fillet of cod around his head, dressing a tutu, you know. So it was you know, the complete range of stuff going on, but it just sat comfortably in it because you didn't have to conform to the idea of showbiz, you know.
Before, I suppose, the Comedy Store opened, really, which was in many ways, the defining moment. It was all gags. It was all gag-orientated, and it had a very narrow range of subject matter, which was the mother-in-law and foreigners, and, you know, it was jokes. It was very misogynistic. It was very stupid. I mean, it assumed no intelligence in the audience.
This drunk homosexual Pakistani squatter takes my mother-in-law to an Irish restaurant.
Suddenly, when clubs like the Comedy Store appeared, there was an outlet for people to almost reinvent stand-up comedy and take it over.
With the opening of the Comedy Store, there was a group of people who got together coming from a different place from where previously comedians had come from, as they'd either come from a sort of musical tradition or from Itmar or from Oxbridge. And this was a group who came from a different place. Many of them came from fringe theatre. Myself and Peter Richardson came from fringe theatres and from a theatre background, or from Manchester University. There's a big sort of Manchester mafia, art schools. It was a different bunch of people doing the comedy.
My great-great-grandfather, he actually caught Moby Dick. Well, they can cure that now, of course. But anyway,
don't like too much applause. That's how fascism started.
It was an exciting movement live on stage, and there were a lot of TV producers coming down to the clubs, the Comic Strip and the Comedy Store, thinking, how can we get this on television?
Welcome to BBC Two Laugh-a-thon. Remember, every smile you give goes to a gorilla somewhere in an internment camp in Zimbabwe.
My name is Richard Dangerous, and this is Avian Dangerous.
I think what was exciting was, first and foremost, it always has to be, it was funny. It made not only me laugh, it made a big room full of people laugh a lot. So it was undoubtedly funny. But it was different funny. I mean, the whole, I think of Vanessa, I think of Neil with the cord, I think of Alexei doing stuff about his communist childhood, I think of Arnold Brown, Two Stereotypes for the Price of One.
Scottish and Jewish, two racial stereotypes for the price of one.
They were talking about different material. They weren't doing constructed jokes, which is what I was still a young producer, but I'd spent, 8 or 10 years working with, and indeed I'd grown up loving comedy, you know, from a child listening to Radio 4. So it was different from that. And it was good. And you know, you don't often get good different. So that's why I was very enthusiastic and went to my bosses at the Veeb and said, we really should record some of this.
OK, well, welcome to the Open University Comedy module. All you sitting down there going, oh, yes, that's very funny. I'll laugh at that when I get home.
There was no theory, movement, programme or whatever about so-called alternative comedy. It was a kind of coincidental coming together of vaguely like-minded people, which is sort of how it's like how any kind of how punk started. Nobody sits in a room and dreams it up. It just sort of evolves at the time, and you can see which way comedy was going.
I never signed up to any agenda and ticked certain boxes at all. You know, because human nature is that you're going to bloody not get on with someone, irrespective of whether or not you think their content and what they were saying is. It wasn't about that at all. It was just that you just found a gathering place, that's all.
If you talk to almost any comic, the big thing is to be funny. That they want to make people laugh, and actually, most of us, and I include myself, are pretty whorish about that. I mean, quite frankly, almost anything if it'll get you a laugh. So, you know, this theory that comics want to change the world or want to make a political statement and so on is slightly exaggerated in my view. What they mainly want to do is make people laugh.
What's green and hairy and goes up and down? What? A gooseberry in a lift. It kills them, I'll tell it.
You get described as a movement, say the alternative comedy movement, and because that's other people describing something that happened. And then everybody asks you questions. So when you invented this alternative comedy movement, you wanted to be described as the alternative comedy movement, so you devised comedy as a way of doing it, which is completely the wrong way round.
I wouldn't describe it as a revolution or a rebellion. There's nothing so organised or coordinated or thought out. It was sort of much more haphazard than that. But it was a sort of general kick up the arse to mainstream comedy, to mainstream television as well. But not in, as I say, not in a kind of pre-planned way. It just evolved over 2 or 3 years that there was a huge need and a demand and an appetite for a kind of comedy that wasn't mainstream, that wasn't racist, that wasn't sexist, as the sayings go, that was a kind of comic equivalent of punk, what punk had done to turn inside out the world of kind of smug, complacent glam rock or whatever. So comedy was kind of doing that. Again, not by anybody's design or plan, it was just happening that way.
From my viewpoint, it wasn't anything I was rebelling against at all. I just felt it was sort of, you were part of a generation that was inevitably going to be just moving things on a bit and shifting the status quo.
Some of the comedians originally were far more politically motivated than others.
Yeah, more political satire, yeah! This is what we come from Islington for, yeah!
I think Rick and Aid and Peter and myself just wanted to be silly. But there were some very politically motivated comedians.
I think that the politics of the period, what was going on, after the election of Thatcher, and then afterwards there was the Falklands War, and then the miners' strike in '84 and '85, informed hugely what was going on inside the kind of world of comedy.
It was a very politically charged time, and it was a time, I think, that kind of polarised people. You certainly didn't feel that the government in any way represented you, your beliefs, or any of the people you knew. And in fact, it seemed, to be working against you and everything that you thought was right.
Most of my stuff was based on a kind of satirical look at what was going on. And because the period was so divided, so confrontational, this provided huge opportunities.
I think Mrs. Thatcher became a sort of a wonderful icon of sort of hatred and naivety, and just something, this icon that you could throw anything at and everything could be blamed on Thatch, which was a very sort of childish thing, which was actually really good and healthy for comedy.
The best gift you can have, really, I think, as an entertainer, is to have a vacuum. You know, is to have everything different to what you are. If you can find your artistic voice at a time when everything is one thing and you're another thing, then it's a wonderful piece of luck.
We had a kind of more overtly political agenda. I want to move on to a lighter topic, Northern Ireland. We started doing gigs at universities and colleges and stuff, and started to earn money. I mean, that was a really no small thing in those days. It was after a year or two, a number of us actually managed to earn something approaching a living out of doing this, which is more than our wildest dreams.
That was the sound of me earning 10 quid.
I think what made it popular was there was an audience out there for alternative comedy, but also there came together some very talented performers. I mean, Rick particularly, is just funny. I mean, he's got funny bounds,
Most of the ones who turned out to have lasting success would have had lasting success anyway because they were good, and good normally gets through.
It's the lunatics taking over the asylum, isn't it? As, everyone's grown up and they are now, if you want to get a show on BBC One, you need to have Dawn French in it because then it'll, people will watch it. She's, everybody's favourite performer.
Inevitably, as they then grew older and their comedy changed slightly and they started to talk about families and mortgages and all those things that happen to people, they became the mainstream. But the mainstream is now quite different. I mean, a show like The Office, you couldn't have conceived of making a show like The Office or The Royal Family or whatever in the days when comedy was The Good Life and Terry and June.
Some of the comedians, some of the comics like Dawn and Jennifer, and their comedy becomes the mainstream comedy culture because it's meeting a need and a demand, and it satisfies an appetite for that kind of comedy.
They've got an expression in the States which is funny is money, and so everyone just wants something which will be popular, something which will sell. It's not that anyone's sold out, it's just that it's taken off and become big business.
Rightly so, things never stand still. So from Vic and Bob, Reeves and Mortimer in the early 90s, they start becoming the alternatives to the alternatives and keeping everybody on their toes, so to speak, which is absolutely, of course, as it should be, and long may it go on. I'm just interested to see in 20 years' time, what's going to make people laugh.